there's a decent chance you don't know the exact day you're most fertile this month. There's an even better chance nobody ever sat you down and explained, in plain terms, how your own body actually works. That gap in knowledge feels modern, almost like a symptom of a world too busy or too awkward to teach the basics. But go back far enough, and you find humans who understood their own bodies with a precision that would surprise you. Somewhere between then and now, we forgot most of it. Think about the last time a question about your own body sent you quietly searching online instead of asking someone in person. Maybe it was something small, a change you noticed, a timing you couldn't quite explain. Most people have that moment more than once, usually alone, usually a little embarrassed, as if curiosity about your own biology were something to apologize for. That discomfort isn't ancient. It's surprisingly recent. Picture a small camp at dusk, an older woman sitting with a group of younger ones, tracing patterns on a bone with a small stone tool. She isn't decorating it. She's counting. Marking days, cycles, the quiet rhythm of fertility that every woman in that group needed to understand, not as private information, but as shared, practical knowledge passed down like fire-making or tracking game. That knowledge kept people alive. It decided when to try for a child and when not to. It was survival information, and it was common. One of the oldest artifacts that hints at this is a small, unassuming object called the Ashango bone, discovered in Central Africa and dated to roughly 20,000 years ago. It's covered in rows of notches, grouped in ways that don't look random. The archaeologist Alexander Marshack proposed something striking, that these groupings weren't just tally marks for counting prey or trade goods, but possibly one of the earliest known lunar calendars, a tool for tracking cycles of 29 or 30 days. If Marshack was right, someone was keeping careful, deliberate records of a rhythm that maps almost exactly onto a menstrual cycle, tens of thousands of years before anyone had a word for reproductive health. The Ashango bone isn't an isolated curiosity, either. Similar notched bones and tally systems, some even older, have turned up at other prehistoric sites across Africa and Europe, and researchers studying them keep landing on the same suspicion, that early record-keeping wasn't just about counting kills or trade goods, but about counting time itself, in cycles that mattered for reproduction, planting, and survival. It's a strange thought, that some of the very first mathematics humans ever practiced may have existed to track fertility rather than currency. Whether or not that specific bone was a fertility calendar, the underlying idea it points to is well supported elsewhere. Across dozens of documented traditional societies, anthropologists have found women who could describe their own fertile windows with startling accuracy, using nothing but observation passed down through generations. Cervical fluid changes. Subtle shifts in body temperature. A slight tenderness. None of it required a laboratory. It required attention, and it required someone older teaching someone younger what to look for, generation after generation, the way you'd teach a child to read the sky before a storm. Compare that to now. Most people today can name more phone features than signs of their own fertility window. Sex education, where it exists at all, often arrives late, sanitized, or wrapped in enough discomfort that half of it is forgotten by the time it might actually matter. The knowledge that ancient women held communally, openly, as a matter of survival, now often has to be sought out privately, sometimes for the first time, well into adulthood. Here's where it gets more surprising. Ancient humans weren't only tracking fertility to achieve pregnancy. They were also actively working to prevent it, and they were remarkably resourceful about how. The most famous example is a plant called silphium, which grew along a narrow strip of coastline near the ancient Greek colony of Cyrene, in what's now Libya. For centuries, silphium was one of the most valuable exports in the ancient Mediterranean world. It appeared on coins. It was mentioned by physicians, poets, and satirists. And its primary use, according to numerous ancient sources including the Roman naturalist Pliny the Elder, was as a contraceptive and abortifacient, taken in carefully measured doses that were apparently common knowledge among women who needed it. Silphium was so effective and so popular that it may have been harvested into extinction by around the 1st century. Think about that. An entire plant species, wiped out not by accident, but by sustained demand for reproductive control, in a world you might assume had no concept of family planning at all. The knowledge of exactly how to prepare and dose it was largely oral, passed between women, sometimes documented by male physicians who were, notably, often just writing down what women already knew and had likely known for generations before any of it reached a scroll. It's worth sitting with how casually silphium shows up in the historical record. It wasn't whispered about or hidden in coded language. Roman comic playwrights joked about it openly on stage. It was stamped onto the coinage of Cyrene as a symbol of civic wealth, right alongside images of its own seed pod. A plant used, among other things, to prevent pregnancy was quite literally minted onto money and carried in the pockets of ordinary citizens. That's not the posture of a society treating reproductive control as scandalous. It's the posture of a society treating it as an economy. This wasn't an isolated case. Historians and ethnobotanists have catalogued dozens of plants used across different ancient cultures for fertility control, from Queen Anne's lace seeds recorded in ancient Indian and later European folk medicine, to specific barks and roots used by indigenous communities across the Americas, each with its own careful preparation, its own dosage passed down like a recipe too important to get wrong. Some of these methods, when later examined by modern researchers, showed genuine hormonal or chemical activity consistent with their traditional use. This wasn't guesswork dressed up as medicine. In many cases, it was accumulated, tested, generational knowledge, refined the same slow way any other survival skill gets refined, by people who couldn't afford to be wrong. There's a reason this kind of knowledge traveled so effectively in small ancient communities, and it isn't just necessity. The anthropologist Helen Fisher, who spent decades studying the evolutionary biology of human attraction and bonding, has pointed out that humans evolved as an unusually social species when it comes to intimate life. Unlike many mammals, human sexuality isn't confined to a narrow fertile window, and unlike many primates, human pair bonding tends to involve extended cooperation, shared resources, and long stretches of caregiving. Fisher's research suggests this created strong evolutionary pressure for early humans to actually understand attraction, timing, and reproduction, not just experience it instinctively. Bodies that came with an instruction manual, however informally transmitted, had a real survival advantage over bodies that didn't. Fisher has also pointed out that this drive toward bonding runs on identifiable biological systems, distinct chemical pathways for lust, attraction, and long-term attachment, each with its own timeline and its own function. Understanding even a rough version of that system, which pathway you were in, what it meant, what tended to come next, would have been genuinely useful information for anyone trying to navigate courtship, partnership, or child-rearing in a small, interdependent group. It wasn't romantic trivia. It was operational knowledge about how your own community actually held together. That instruction manual didn't come from books. It came from proximity. Multiple generations of women often lived, worked, and slept in close quarters, which meant questions got asked and answered constantly, almost by accident, simply because privacy as we understand it barely existed. A girl reaching puberty wasn't handed a pamphlet. She was surrounded by people who had already been through it, watching, absorbing, occasionally being told directly what to expect and what it meant. Knowledge moved sideways and downward through a community continuously, not in a single scheduled conversation that everyone dreaded. Modern life quietly dismantled most of those conditions. Extended families scattered. Elders moved into separate households or disappeared from daily life altogether. Privacy, for good reason in many respects, became the norm, but it also closed off the accidental transmission that once did so much of the teaching. What used to be absorbed gradually now often has to be actively sought, usually alone, frequently through sources with no accountability for accuracy. The gap didn't appear because people got less curious about their own bodies. It appeared because the informal, communal classroom quietly disappeared. There's also a subtler loss here, beyond just facts about cycles and plants. Ancient communal knowledge tended to treat sex and reproduction as ordinary, practical subjects, discussed with the same matter-of-fact tone you'd use for weather or foraging. Shame wasn't entirely absent from ancient societies, but the sheer necessity of shared reproductive knowledge often pushed practicality ahead of embarrassment. You couldn't afford excessive squeamishness about a topic your survival depended on understanding accurately. Compare that to how often the subject gets handled today, sometimes with more discomfort surrounding the conversation than around the biology itself. None of this means the past was simply better. Maternal mortality was devastating. Not every remedy worked, and some surely caused harm alongside their benefits. But the sheer scope of what was known, tracked, tested, and passed on is worth pausing on. Somewhere in that Ishango bone's careful notches, in Silphium's now extinct fields, in generations of women trading observations by firelight, there was a level of practical, communal fluency about the human body that most people today would have to work hard to match. It's tempting to assume knowledge only ever accumulates, that each generation simply knows more than the one before it. The history of reproductive knowledge complicates that story. Some of it was genuinely lost, not disproven, not replaced by something better, just misplaced somewhere between the collapse of oral traditions and the rise of institutions that treated the subject with more discomfort than the people who first figured it out ever did. Progress, in this particular corner of human history, didn't move in a straight line. You inherited a body built by that same long evolutionary history, with the same rhythms those ancient women once tracked on bone and remembered by heart. What's changed isn't the biology. It's the classroom. The knowledge that once passed easily from hand to hand, generation to generation, now has to be found on purpose, often later than it should be, often alone. The instruction manual never disappeared. It just stopped being handed down.